Good afternoon, everyone. Our first speaker is Dr. Jess Hartshorn, who is an assistant professor of forest health at Clemson University. She has been at her current position since August of 2018, after spending 2 years with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources as a forest health specialist. She completed her master's and PhD at the University of Arkansas, working with native and invasive pine-infesting wood wasps, biological control with a parasitic nematode, and a symbiotic phytotoxic fungus. Her program focuses on effects and management of forest disturbance, including invasive species and climate change. Welcome, Jess. The floor is yours.
Thanks for the introduction. And I'm glad that's the picture that I ended up sending you, because that little boy is almost 5 now. So
they do grow fast.
Okay, so assuming that everybody can see the slideshow.
You're good?
Okay, great. Awesome. While my background is more of a bug person, most of the work that the folks in my lab do now involves invasive plants and specifically calorie pear. So just a quick snapshot of some of the people involved in this research. Forrest Palmer is my lab manager. He's like the MacGyver of the lab. Dr. Dave Coyle, who I'm sure a lot of you already know and work with. And then Dr. Harper McMinn-Souter did her PhD at Ohio State with Reed Johnson on pollinators. Prabina Sharma is a master's student with me. We're also working on calorie pear. Connor and Alex were both undergraduate research technicians. And then Zella is my current lab technician, and she loves it when I use that photo of her. In general, we are interested in anything invasion ecology. So some of the major questions that we ask are, what factors are affecting the invasion process, which I'll show you in a second? How are communities affected by invasive species? And then also, how do we manage for invasive and non-invasive pests to promote overall forest health? So this is the process of invasion, starting from transportation and going all the way to impacts. So if something doesn't make it all the way into that impact stage, we really don't consider it an invasive species. The general rule of thumb, it's called the TENS rule, is that only about 10% of species make it past each stage of the invasion process. If we start out with 10,000 individuals, which might sound like a lot, but I'll give you a couple numbers here in a minute that will dwarf that. By the time we get past transportation into introduction, we're down to 1,000. Once we get those 1,000 that are actually introduced, only 100 of them actually establish. Out of those 100 that establish at the site where they're introduced, only 10 of those actually spread beyond that site of initial introduction. And then of those 10 that spread beyond that one site, only one of them actually causes any kind of impact that we would perceive as making it a pest. So something that's affecting us economically or ecologically, something that we care about. Only one out of that 10,000 makes it to that impact stage. I'm mostly a tree person. And as of the other day, when I looked this number up on the invasive plants database, there were 243 species of invasive trees in the United States. So if you think about that, one causing the impact for something to be considered invasive, got to get to that stage. We have 243, and that's one out of every 10,000 on average. And that's just trees. That's not grasses, forbs. That doesn't even get into animals at all. That's just trees in the United States. So like I mentioned, we work a lot with calorie pear. So a little bit about why calorie pear is such a good model organism to work with. Number one, it has a really well-known introduction history. This photo to the right was taken by Frank Meyer on one of his expeditions to China, specifically to collect calorie pear. It is a really wide distribution across the United States, so we can study it in a lot of different places with a lot of different variables. It has really distinctive features in terms of really early flowering. Their flowers are really bright white. Some of the cultivars have really specific and unique fall colors. So there's a lot of features that we can look at that are distinctive from natives that might be in the same area. And it was recently listed as invasive and actually added to some do not sell lists for a couple states that we'll also talk about in a minute. So this is the EDMAP's distribution of Pyrus caloriana. So that's the species from which the cultivars are derived. And it's present in 25 states. So that's where it's been identified as growing outside of cultivation. And in 13 of those states, it is identified somewhere as invasive. So this is very different whether you are in Ohio or Georgia or South Carolina because the agencies are set up different. But in 13 of those states, it is identified as an invasive plant. So I mentioned the distinctive white flowers. Most, if not all of you, have probably seen these blooming in the really early spring. It's usually the first thing that pops up, and that's when everybody notices it. By about summertime, you start getting these small, they're really hard fruits that form in clusters, like in that bottom left-hand photo. If you find Pyrus that have hybridized, so Pyrus caloriana can hybridize with like Asian pear, European pear. When you find those hybrids, the fruits may be a little bit bigger, a little softer, look a little different, but Pyrus caloriana, they're very small and also pretty hard. And then they also have that pretty distinctive leaf shape. So getting back to our invasion process, we have kind of been dissecting this species along this invasion gradient or invasion process, starting with transportation. So I mentioned Frank Meyer. He was born in 1875, died in 1918, pretty young. He was only 42, and he actually died on his expedition to collect calorie pear seeds. So he was hired by the USDA after he emigrated to the United States, studied botany in the Netherlands before that. And he was hired on to the Office of Seed and Plant Introduction. So he was tasked specifically with going out on these expeditions to different places. A lot or most really were in Asia and specifically in China. And he was looking for plants that we could bring back to the United States to introduce to deal with the drought situation that we were having due to expanded agriculture. And so this office by 1912 had introduced on purpose over 34,000 species of plants. Frank Meyer alone introduced over 2,500 species of plants. So not all of these have become invasive. Some of them are very useful. So he introduced alfalfa and several species of stone fruits. He's actually got a cultivar of lemon that's named after him. So he introduced some citrus as well. And he also introduced the first oil-bearing soybean, which was used in a lot of industrial practices shortly after that. And he also was sent to China on an expedition to identify the fungus that causes chestnut blight that was found at the Bronx Zoo. So he actually went out and collected specimens to confirm that they were finding Pryphenectria at the Bronx Zoo on those American chestnut. These are just a couple other images that these are all available through the USDA on their archive. They've got an actual Frank Meyer collection where they've got like a 200 and some odd page transcript of all of his letters during these expeditions and stuff. So in 1916, like I mentioned, he went back to China specifically to collect calorie pear. He ended up having to stay an extra year because of civil unrest. He couldn't get out of the region. And then by the time he went to go leave, he boarded a riverboat in May of 1918, and his body was found 5 days later, and they buried him in Shanghai. So nobody really knows exactly what happened to him, but he did die in the process of bringing Pyrus caloriana back to the United States. So that's how it was actually transported here. But then how did it go from transportation to introduction? So most of us know calorie pear as a street tree or a neighborhood tree. But like I mentioned, it was actually introduced for agricultural purposes. So on the left-hand side is a European pear that's been affected by fire blight, which is a bacterial disease that, as the name suggests, blights the tip and kind of looks like it's been burnt, like you can see in that photo. And so calorie pear was known to be pretty fire blight resistant. So they started using the rootstock of calorie pear and grafting on European pear to essentially try and save the European pear industry from fire blight. And then once we got into the early 60s, some of those cultivars were identified as having a really nice crown shape that would look really good in an ornamental setting. And that's kind of what started the process of it being planted as a landscape tree. So there's over 24 cultivars of Pyrus caloriana at this point. The first being Bradford, which is the one that I think most people are familiar with. That was created in 1960 from this Chinese seed that Frank Meyer brought back and planted at a station in Maryland at the USDA. So this is the cultivar with the earliest flowering, but if you have any experience with Bradford pear, you know that once it hits 15, 20, 25 years old, you just kind of look at it wrong and it splits right down the middle. These other cultivars, Chanticleer, Red Spire, Aristocrat, are not as known for splitting, but they have a lot of the same problems. And some of these we don't even know where the origin was. Like one of these, the parent was unknown. And then immediately after the cultivar was created, someone came through the plot and cleared it out for cultivation. And so nobody knows what that parent was or what happened to it because it was cleared out. But each of them were created to have different shapes of the crown. Some were pyramidal, some more columnar, some were created for their fall colors. But really, we had the last cultivar was called the New Bradford, and that was created in 1996. And that was the last cultivar of Pyrus caloriana that was created to be put on the market. So that is how we get introduction, but we also want to look at factors that are affecting establishment because we know that not every ornamental tree that you plant escapes and takes over every area. So what makes calorie pear so unique or so different from a lot of these other ornamentals that we have that makes it so aggressive? We know that there are environmental factors, slope, aspect, climate, elevation. Although calorie pear can grow in pretty much any environment, from a lowland all the way to a rocky outcropping, much like the dandelion here on the right. But because it is so associated with being an ornamental and being a landscape tree, we also wanted to look at some of the socioeconomic factors or the cultural factors that might affect establishment, spread, and maybe introduction of like other cultivars or other hybrids, including median income. We looked at population density as well as distance to roads, which tends to be an important variable for some other invasive plants. So to look at establishment and these variables, our GIS technician went out and collected GPS coordinates for, I think he did 8 different classifications of habitats. And this was in about this time last year, actually. So this was all in upstate South Carolina, I think a little bit in southern North Carolina. And then he downloaded aerial imagery using 2 different satellites to look at those classifications based on reflectance that's collected by these. In our case, we use free multispectral data for the purposes of creating something that could be used by land managers. So we wanted to make sure it was cheap, easily accessible, easy to work with, intuitive, all that good stuff. And then he looked at maximum likelihood and minimum distance classifications to try and identify new infestations, which we could then ground truth. So in an image form, this is what we get. So this is Clemson and the surrounding area. That blue is Lake Hartwell, and I guess part of Lake Keowee as well. So you can see his classifications that he used. We had high intensity urban. So that would be like Greenville, downtown area. And you see a little bit of the Clemson, Anderson area is highlighted as well. We've got crop fields, water, of course, for Lake Hartwell, grasslands, and then coniferous forests and deciduous forests, as well as the lower intensity urban sites, which are more like peri-urban or even a little bit rural. And then one of his classifications was just calorie pair. We were attempting to train this program. He used Imagine to train this program to identify a calorie pair tree and differentiate it from every other kind of deciduous forest in upstate South Carolina. And he got 82% overall accuracy, which I was kind of blown away with. And really 66% accuracy identifying calorie pair. Initially, I thought that that was a little low, but when you think about it, calorie pair is blooming in February, March, at least in these parts. And this was in May and June. So the flowers were gone. Everything else was leafed out. So this was just a green deciduous forest. And it was still able to pick out that one species 66% of the time accurately, which when I kind of reframe it to think about it that way, it's actually pretty amazing that we could do that just with free Sentinel-2 satellite data or planet data. So we didn't look at hyperspectral. We didn't pay for the, 5 centimeter resolution or anything like that. And we were still able to get 66% accuracy, which was pretty cool. So then after that, he wanted to look at those environmental and also social or socioeconomic variables that were affecting that distribution of calorie pair. So I mentioned we looked at population density. That was actually not significantly related. We were kind of having a little bit of trouble identifying which SES factor would be best in the model. And then after talking about it, we thought, you don't see Bradford pears planted in a downtown area. You see a lot of red maples, sycamores for whatever reason, but not a lot of Bradford pears. Where you see Bradford pears tends to be the more middle and upper middle class neighborhoods that are kind of the suburbs, the urban sprawl around those urban areas, but not actually in the urban areas and also not out in farmland. And so once we switched out population density with median income, our R squared went way up. And I believe last I checked, we were sitting at an R squared of like 0.87 with just median income and slope, I believe. So we're still in the process of getting sites, doing the ground truthing and all that. So we don't actually have a finalized model, but right now it's looking pretty good in terms of being able to predict where we should find calorie pair and maybe where it would pop up next. And so to continue down the establishment route, we also wanted to look at the biological components behind that because these cultivars, people were planting Bradford pear under the, not even an assumption, they were just told Bradford pear is sterile, which it is. It cannot self-cross or anything like that. But the problem is that Bradford pear is not the only cultivar on the landscape, and these cultivars can cross. It's not even the only pyrus on the landscape, and they can cross with other pyrus as well and create viable fruit. And also, if you can see where this arrow is pointing, those cultivars are created from grafting onto Pyrus caloriana rootstock. And so that rootstock is still the wild Pyrus caloriana. It's not that nice cultivar that comes up in a single stem. And so when it experiences damage or any kind of stress that initiates that stump sprouting response of the tree, those stump sprouts are going to be essentially just wild Pyrus caloriana. And While it does flower really early, we know that European honeybees are out that early. They're one of the few things that are out at the same time that Callery pear is flowering. And European honeybees are also quite the generalist. They like just about everything. And actually, I'll get back to the pollinators in a second. I thought I had a little note on there, but I guess not. So we're not actually looking at the bird part, but a colleague at University of Dayton had an undergraduate student do an honors thesis, and she was looking at different birds that consume and therefore probably spread Callery pear. In the literature, it's mostly reported that European starlings do that, American robins also, which you can see on this figure. I just noticed she was apparently doing field work on Christmas in 2021. But she was also able to add cedar waxwings to that list, which is a native bird. And so we know that there's probably other native birds that are doing this spreading as well. And we think that that's why you see this type of infestation pattern a lot. So you see it a lot along power lines or fence rows. It's not one of those things where you get one tree that pops up in the center and then it spreads outward. The infestations seem to start along the edge, especially if there's a fence there or any kind of man-made structure to give birds something to perch on. So theoretically, they would consume those berries, come perch on this power line or fence or whatever is there, some kind of building, poop out the seeds, and now you have a new infestation of Callery pear. But we don't see this with other species that you might expect to see it with. So we got kind of curious, started looking into peach because we don't have any native pyrus in the United States. All the pyrus that we have here has been imported and has been grown commercially for some reason. We don't have any North American native pyrus. We do, however, have North American native prunus, but we also have been planting peach, which is Prunus persica, for much longer than we've been planting Pyrus calleriana. So we did a quick look on iNat or iNaturalist. If you are not an iNat user, I highly recommend it. It's how I identified like half the species in my yard. But anyways, if you look, I just did a little less than the full north-south of the U.S. And I also didn't include the western, like Pacific Northwest or California, because they do have wild Callery pear, invasive Callery pear out there, but their populations are a lot lower. So I did that with Pyrus calleriana as well as Prunus persica, so peach, and we get almost 22,000 observations of Callery pear compared to 6,500 of peach. And if you're not super familiar with the introduction history of peach, this has been here since at least the 1500s. That's the expected timeline that it was introduced by French colonizers. We produce peaches commercially in 20 states. South Carolina is actually number 2 behind California. In the United States, we produce over 806,000 tons of peaches every single year. We have over 74,000 acres that are planted, and we know that the production value has been increasing over the last few years. So why do we have Callery pear, which is a landscape tree, but not planted in nearly the abundance as something like peach, but we have it really impacting negatively these habitats, and it's very aggressive and just takes over everything. So kind of wrapping back around to pollinators, which I'm going to touch on pollinators a few times, but we wanted to look at pollinators' role in this potential like variable spread of different species. So here we've got our European honeybee. Bottom left-hand corner you see is Chickasaw plum. That's a prunus. It's native. And on the right-hand corner, you see southern crabapple, malice. Again, that's native. Those are the two species that co-occur most with calorie pair in terms of flower production and blooming. So we thought if pollinators are out visiting calorie pair, because it's one of the few resources available at the time, would they also be visiting Chickasaw plum and southern crabapple? And really, what are the implications of this and what does it lead to? So see, pollinators are on this screen as well. So just keep that in mind. We will come back to it. So how we know that we have all these different moving parts, we have all these different components. So how exactly is calorie pair affecting them? So we've kind of looked at, we know about transportation, we've kind of looked at introduction, started talking about spread a little bit, and spread and impacts are very related because you kind of have to have one to have the other. And so we wanted to look at this with several different guilds of, I want to say arthropods. Not everything is an arthropod. Most of them are, but native plants are included in there too. First, we looked at herbivores. You will notice that this is my spare bedroom because this was during COVID. So I was known throughout my neighborhood as the caterpillar lady because I was growing caterpillars, not just in my house, in my spare bedroom, but I was also growing them on the front porch. And people were walking all the time because it's COVID and you can't go and do anything. So people were just walking around the neighborhood all the time. And I constantly had kids coming up to the house and wanting to like look in the rearing cages and hold the caterpillars and stuff. So I was the caterpillar lady, which I'm fine with. So to look at herbivores, two of these were caterpillars. So the kids really, really liked Eastern tent caterpillar, I think because it's so cool looking. Not super hyped about fall webworm, which I totally understand. They're, much more lame looking than Eastern tent caterpillar. Both native caterpillars, though. Eastern tent caterpillar comes out in the spring. It's much more of a specialist. Usually you find it on black cherry or some other kind of prunus species, those webs that are in the crotches of trees early in the spring. Fall webworm is a bit later. We'll probably see those here around like into August. Those are the webs on the outside of the branches. And those are generalists. So you can find fall webworms on cherries, just like you can find them on hickories or sourwood or most any other plant. And then Japanese beetle, which I'm sure we're all unfortunately familiar with, was our non-native or invasive representative that's, again, a generalist, comes out in the summer, sticks around for some weeks, but really feeds on pretty much anything. We collected it from roses, but they'll feed on just about anything. So for all three of these species, we had a choice and a no choice. So our choice test is on the right. So we gave them their primary host. So that's where we collected them, as well as two secondary hosts. So that would be something that's in their recorded host range, but was not the plant that we actually collected them from. A non-host, which for our cases was always tulip poplar because nothing eats tulip poplar apparently. And then calorie pair. They all got calorie pair. And then we gave them a no choice for each one of those species. So they had 5 discs of calorie pair, 5 discs of their primary host. And so we did that for every one of these 3 species. Like I mentioned, this was, the primary host is what we collected them on. That was black cherry for our Eastern tent caterpillar, persimmon for fall webworm, and black raspberry for our Japanese beetles. But we also collected mongrel hickory for a couple of those, hawthorn, ornamental roses, as well as sweet gum, red maple. And then, like I said, tulip poplar was our nobody eats it non-host control plant, essentially. So I'm going to start out with our specialist, and that was our Eastern tent caterpillar. So the specialists are going to continuously feed on plants that have, a certain set of defensive chemicals. If they have fed on those defensive chemicals since they hatched from their eggs, they should theoretically be able to metabolize whatever those chemicals are. And you can see with our Eastern tent caterpillar, while we collected them on black cherry, so that's our primary host, they were able to feed on both secondary hosts almost as much as the primary, even though that was not the host plant that we collected them on. And they fed plenty on all three of those, whether it was the choice experiment or the no choice experiment. They did prefer the black cherry a bit in the choice, but it was not a significant difference. Non-host, they fed not at all, or they did a couple little nibbles as a test bite, but then moved on. Now, calorie pair, when they were given a choice, and so they had all these other species present, they did feed on calorie pair. Not quite as much as their primary and secondary hosts, but they still fed quite a bit. But when we did not give them the choice, their feeding went down significantly. And so they did not have the same response with any of the other species that we gave them to feed on. But for some reason, which I'll get into in a second, when they were not given an option to feed on different things, they really did not feed on calorie at all. So our fall webworm, as a reminder, this was our native generalist caterpillar, fed a lot on both primary and secondary hosts. It actually did feed a little bit on tulip poplar, which I was kind of surprised because it's not supposed to be listed as a host, at least in the literature. But on calorie pair, their feeding actually appears to have gone up. It's actually very slight, and it's not a significant difference when we look at standard errors and we do a Kruskal-Wallis test, but they were kind of all over the place, which as a generalist, they really don't have the ability to metabolize those defense chemicals. So it makes sense that when they're not given a choice that they would reduce their feeding because they're not able to only feed on that one species with that one set of defensive chemicals. They have to go between a bunch of different species. Now, Japanese beetle, we fully expected to be like the calorie pair eating champion. It's a generalist, it's invasive, it's even from the same place as calorie pair, but it was not a fan. Did not feed on calorie pair in the choice, and it also did not feed on calorie pair in the no choice. Really, it did hardly any feeding in the no choice at all. So it was a very true generalist species in that it would not consume if it did not have the ability to feed on several different things. So we know that it negatively affects herbivores now. Even our invasive Japanese beetle cannot feed on calorie pair. So let's get back to the pollinator question for a second. My master's student, Prabina, looked at pollinator communities at calorie pair infested sites and was trying to get an idea of what communities were there and who the major flower visitors of calorie pair were. So she did that with these painted cups, as well as a blue vein trap. We did not have luck with the blue vein trap, though. And what she found was that we just, again, got a lot of generalist pollinators in her cups. And a lot of these were actually flies. And the most common bee, I believe, that we got was Apis mellifera, so European honeybee. So if calorie pair is allowing for this additional floral resource, it's not going to benefit our specialist pollinators, which are the ones that we are seeing, the most detrimental impacts on. It's going to benefit these generalist species that we're not super worried about. Toxomeris, a syrphid fly, a hoverfly. So we also are currently in the process of looking at insects that bore into twigs of calorie pair. These are super fancy rearing containers, which is a Home Depot bucket with a sheet taped on the top. And here's Alex, my former undergrad. So we put them in these buckets. We hung them around the edge of forest for 3 months and then put them in these rearing containers. And then we collected the bugs out of the rearing containers a few months later. So those are currently in vials in the Arthropod Museum. And she also did this with leaf litter arthropods. And so we had some collaborators in North Carolina collect leaf litter for us as well. And basically, we just created this little collecting apparatus that sifted the leaf litter so that the arthropods would fall into, again, a super fancy container that's just a pillowcase. Put all of these bugs into this little bucket, also known as a Berlazy funnel, flip the light on. The arthropods really do not like the heat coming off of the lights. You have to use an incandescent bulb, actually, which is difficult to find right now. And then they go to the bottom of the bucket. We are masochists as entomologists, so they fall into ethanol and die. And then we put them in these lovely petri dishes where we take photos of them and, again, continue with the parade of dead bugs. And so here are 4 samples from our North Carolina collections. And 2 of them are from calorie pair leaf litter, and 2 of them are from, it was a mixture of, it was a pine forest, but there was a lot of cherry there as well. So in 3 seconds, I want you to guess to yourself, I don't know, to your cat, mine is over here, which one is calorie pair and which one is the natives. 3, 2, 1. If you guessed the one without very many bugs in it, you were correct. So we're seeing now that we've got negative effects on leaf litter arthropods as well. And again, these are mostly in vials in the Arthropod Museum, so we don't have the final data, but this is a pretty good representation of what those samples look like. So then a PhD student did some plantings with native plants in soil that she literally just collected calorie pair leaf litter, crumpled it up and added it into the litter, mixed it up and planted a few different native species. And across the board, she found that the natives that were planted in tubs with that amended soil, so the soil that had the calorie pair leaf litter in it, those natives had significantly slower leaf out and just slower growth overall, much higher mortality, and also less root growth. So she snipped the roots off of each one of these plants, and we're in the process of measuring those root hairs. But so far, it looks like the root hairs are not only less abundant, but also shorter. So we know that we're also having negative effects on native plants as well. So again, we'll go back to my white cat. Why is this happening? And so right now, we are working with the analytical lab through our College of Ag on campus to do metabolomics screening of calorie pair and compare that to peach because, like I mentioned, we don't see these issues with peach, but we do see them with calorie pair. And also look at black cherry since that was one of our species in our herbivore tests that we did. We actually did these collections already, and then I'm not really sure what happened. They're doing renovations or something, but we have to do the collections again. So I was hoping to actually have some results for this, but yesterday I got an email that we have to go out and do 50 collections again. So that should be fun because it's 90 degrees now. Okay, so that's the full invasion process, but I did add my little asterisk here of management because really that's kind of what this all comes down to. For invasive plants, we think a lot of like on small scale things like hand pulling, girdling if it's an invasive tree, cultural control, so making the environment less suitable for that species, which, you know, is going to be really variable depending on the species, as well as things like physical barriers and things like that. There's a lot of talk about grazing and herbivory. Goats are cute. Like I will cede that point. Goats are adorable. It's a wonderful outreach tool and it gets people interested in invasive species management when they see a bunch of goats eating privet on the side of the road and they stop and they ask what's going on. Like it's a wonderful outreach tool. in terms of long-term management, probably not the best option. So we were looking at prescribed fire and herbicide to control calorie pair. Prescribed fire specifically because out of the 45 million acres of planted forests that we have in the Southeast, most of those are going to be pine dominated, and especially the pines, like longleaf has a very fire associated life cycle. So we burn more in the southeastern US than the rest of the United States combined. Well, not only do we have more forests than any other region in the United States, but we burn a higher percentage of those forests as well. On average, it's about 6 million acres in the Southeast alone. And every natural resource manager, forest health specialist, anybody that I talk to, they still say we need to get more fire on the ground. I expect those numbers to hopefully increase. But because it's such a commonly used tool in the Southeast, we wanted to see, how does fire affect calorie pair in these commercial pine stands? So we worked with some folks at the Georgia Forestry Commission, Bartram State Forest, which is near the center of the state. And we identified 5 plots that were in stands that had been or had gotten prescribed fire in May of 2021. So we went back in August of 2021 and we measured the number of dead stems, the number of live stems of calorie pair, and then also the height of each one of those stems. And here we've just got some of the plot information. So you can see that the basal area was about the same. The average diameter was about the same. And so across those 5 plots, the fewest number of, we were calling them clusters because a lot of times you'll get 5, 10, 15, 20 plus stems out of a single rootstock. So each one of those being an individual cluster. We had anywhere from 27 was our low, all the way up to 151 clusters. So each one of those clusters then having multiple stems in it. And this was 3 months after the burn, and we have 424 dead stems that were presumably killed in the fire, and then over 1,100 live stems in that 3-month period, with our average live stem height being 9 inches. So in 3 months after killing those stems of calorie pair, they were able to, on average, produce 3 additional stems from that one that was killed. And each of those 3 stems was on average of 9 inches tall in 3 months. So, can you kill it with fire? That is a big no. It seems to make them angry and they come back with a vengeance. So what about herbicide? That's our go-to with invasive plants. For better or worse, it works, So this is actually part of a project that COIL has been working on. And you can see the y-axis here is percent mortality. And so for all of these, that dark circle being the control, for all of these except for one, we see upwards of 100% mortality. So these are small trees. But even for our middle-sized trees, so these are like medium-sized trees, so about the size of your thumb, but not like a full-on mature calorie pair. All the way to the left, again, is our control. So you see 100% of it is alive. But for every single one of those applications, we have pretty significant mortality. And this is preliminary data, hence the word art. So again, this is not finalized. We're still in the process of doing those measurements and actually comparing them between treatment types. So does herbicide work? Yes, especially when used the right way. So some of them you can apply to the soil. That seems to be the least effective. Hack and squirt is our favorite thing to say, at least. But cut stump, that seems to be the way to go for any of these active ingredients. You're not only removing the tree itself, but you're also applying the herbicide. So that was like taking a sip from a water hose. So just to kind of pull it all together regarding our invasion process, Calories started to be banned in different states. It was banned in Ohio a couple years ago. The ban goes into effect in South Carolina October of this year. Hopefully, additional states follow suit. I'm part of a group right now that's doing what's called a horizon scan, national horizon scan of ornamental plants, where we're doing risk assessments for the plants that are most commonly brought into the US. So we can try to identify these before they get to that impact stage. Regarding introduction, there's other groups in the Southeast at NC State that are looking at viability of fruit among these different hybrids. We are going to be doing some greenhouse crosses, which I'll show you in a second. It's my last slide, to look at hybridization. And then hopefully tweaking that remote sensing model and being able to create a tool that land managers can use for detection and monitoring of calorie pair with remote sensing. Establishment. So we know that we have that reduced herbivory. We saw that we have reduced growth and higher mortality of our native plants. So we think that there's something going on with those defense chemicals or secondary metabolites. So that is those are the collections that we have to redo next week. For spread, again, going back to the geographically weighted regression part of that remote sensing model and looking at different birds and potentially mammals. I know Coyle's very interested in looking at deer, the potential for deer to spread calorie pair. And then kind of looking at the big picture of impacts of calorie pairs. So playing into biotic homogenization of habitats across, especially the eastern United States. Where do we go from here? This is a lot of stuff all happening over the last few years with regards to calorie pair. And so the next steps that we're doing this summer and fall is to look at, can we actually get viable hybrids? So we're going to cross southern crabapple, Chickasaw plum, wild peach with each other, and then also with calorie pair. And then also we're going to hopefully collect pollen off of pollinators that we've collected at calorie pair, if you could follow that. So here you can see this lovely little European honeybee with those chaps of pollen on. So we want to try and identify that, and then think about what are the implications for genetics of our natives. I think I went a few minutes over. So quick acknowledgements, everybody that has played a part in this. This is not even an exhaustive list. So yeah, and I'll take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Jess. No, you did not go over time. In fact, you were 3 minutes below the time. Okay. So we have 2 more minutes for questions. Thank you again. That was really great. That's very informative. And I tell you, each spring when I see this sea of white, it's just, blah. Yeah, I hate it. Yeah. I hate it.
Yeah. It's pretty gross.
Okay, guys. So time for questions. Put it in the chat, questions and answers. Just raise your hand or unmute yourself if you want to do that. And we'll pass on your questions. Jess, I have one just to get us started. As far as what resources are the bees using from the pair? Do you think that they're going mostly for the nectar, or do you think that they're actually collecting pollen for their brood?
We don't know. Just get it out there. So my postdoc has been talking about working with some local apiarists who have hives that are close to calorie pair infestations, and seeing if we can set up some kind of pollen trap to see, like, are they actually bringing it back to their hives and using it? Or are these just incidental? The flowers are open and they land. Hopefully we can get an idea of that with our pollinator collections this coming spring, where we're actually going to take the pollen off of their bodies. But it would still be nice to know, like, what are they taking back to the hive? What are they actually using? Are they getting any kind of sustenance from it, or is it totally incidental? So unfortunately, we don't have that question answered yet.
Yeah, sounds like you're on the right track to look for some answers there.
I hope so.
Just out of curiosity, I actually had netted earlier this year some something, whatever I could catch. Mostly I was interested in the bees. So I live in Stockbridge, so on the south side of Atlanta, maybe about 20 miles south. And just like you said, Andrinas were there. There were some halictids. I'm pretty sure I got a couple of serotinas. I think I'm almost. I have to go back and make sure that I'm correct, but I think I caught a few colitis in there as well. But I have to check on
And
that.
we did catch some of those too. So that was not a full list. That was just the most common ones that she got.
Yeah. But yeah, I also was very curious about what comes, because in previous years I thought that I would see almost nothing other than honeybees, and sometimes I've seen up. I haven't netted them, but up higher in the canopy I see bombus queens. But
Yes.
this year it was really like, earlier I was netting like a whole bunch of Andrina males. We're talking like,
Hmm.
and again, I'm not an entomologist.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at some cute bees. So I don't really know
And
what species there were. I haven't keyed them out.
we, I think Probina found, I think she's up to at least a dozen morpho species of Andrina. And so even the females and the males, you can't necessarily pair them all the time unless you are like an Andrina expert, which I am not. So yeah, a lot of hers are like Andrina species A, Andrina species B, that sort of thing, because yeah, it takes a lot of time and person power, like a surprising amount to key those out.
For sure.
Yeah.
Any questions from the audience? We have one from
Is it a
William
favorable
Allgood.
termite?
Uh, Test the wood. Is it a favorable termite bait?
Mikey Lishan in Athens with the Forest Service has been looking at decomposers of invasive plants in general or invasive trees. Calorie pear is one of those that he's been looking at. So I know that he's been taking like whole stems and looking at the decomposing arthropods over time. I would have to check with Mike because I'm not sure what stage that project is on, but I know that they're looking at that.
I know Mike, and we haven't invited him, so maybe next year we'll get him to come up and give us an
There you
update.
go.
He just recently published a really good paper on bee and butterfly decline based on 15 years of data that they've been doing in Georgia, and it's really depressing to see
Hmm.
how much
Yeah.
that's. Yeah. So anyhow, he's got a lot to talk about in addition to the forestry part. All right, guys. Well, any other questions? If not, I have one more question, and that relates to the plants. In that in those trays or those growing boxes where you had the plants with some material that came from the leaf litter, I suppose. I think that's what you
Mhm.
said. Was that pine?
Yeah. So loblolly was one of the species that we grew, but we also planted persimmon and sweet gum. So those were our two that like you see them pop up in disturbed sites, especially sweet gum. Um, so those were kind of our like disturbance species to see how they would do in that amended soil.
Yeah, for sure. They do pop up a lot.
Yeah.
Not always desired, but they are what they are.
Usually not. Yeah.
Well, we're at 4 o'clock. Thank you again, Jess. It
All
was
right.
great information, and we will make sure that if there were any additional questions, we'll pass them on.
Okay. Awesome. Thank
Thank
you.
you.